At 3:51 in the morning on July 4th, 2025, a Texas summer camp woke up to a 26-foot wall of water. In less than 45 minutes, the Guadalupe River rose from a calm stream to a deadly torrent, trapping 27 people from Camp Mystic in the dark. It became the deadliest inland flood in the United States in 50 years. Camp director Dick Eastland died trying to drive a group of girls to safety. His Apple Watch recorded the moment his SUV hit a tree and went under. But the terrifying part is not the water, it is that this disaster was predicted years ago. The geology of Flash Flood Alley makes this kind of flooding inevitable. On the night of July 4th, there were no sirens, no public warning system, and no evacuation plan. So how did a single night of rain turn into a catastrophe that killed 137 people? And why, despite modern technology, was no one ready? This is the story of the Camp Mystic disaster. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what is underneath the Texas Hill Country. The region sits on the Balcones Escarpment, a wall of ancient limestone cliffs that rises from the Gulf coastal plain. The soil above that limestone is thin, in some places only inches deep. Beneath it is solid rock as impermeable as a parking lot. When rain falls on the hill country, the ground does not absorb it. Every drop runs straight off the surface and funnels into the narrow canyons and river valleys that cut through the terrain. This geology is why the region is called Flash Flood Alley. It is one of the most flood-prone landscapes in North America. Rivers here do not rise gradually. They detonate. The weather system that arrived on the night of July 3rd was not a hurricane, it was not a named storm. It was something most people have never heard of, a mesoscale convective vortex, spelled MCV. It is a spinning cluster of thunderstorms, typically only 30 to 60 miles wide, small enough to be missed in standard weather analysis. But when an MCV stalls, it can dump extraordinary volumes of rain over a single location for hours. This one was fueled by tropical moisture from the remnants of Tropical Storm Barry, which had made landfall in southeastern Mexico 5 days earlier. That moisture merged with an atmospheric trough over the southwestern United States, and the resulting system parked itself directly over the headwaters of the Guadalupe River. 6.5 inches of rain fell on the town of Hunt in 3 hours. Parts of the watershed received over 20 inches. That is 4 months of average rainfall in a single night. On limestone, that absorbs nothing. All of that water had exactly one place to go: downhill and fast. At 1:14 in the morning on July 4th, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for Kerr County. Dick Eastland received the alert on his phone. Camp Mystic was home to roughly 550 girls that night, sleeping in wooden cabins built along the Guadalupe River. The campers had no access to phones or electronics. Cell service in the area was unreliable. The nearest town, Hunt, has a population of a few hundred. By all accounts, the warning Eastland received was a standard alert, the kind the hill country gets multiple times every storm season. He began communicating with family members over walkie-talkie. By 2 in the morning, he started moving girls from lower-lying cabins toward the camp's recreation hall on higher ground. Over the next 90 minutes, more than 150 campers and counsellors were relocated, but the river was not behaving like anything anyone at that camp had seen. The USGS gauge closest to Camp Mystic, located 5 miles downstream where the north and south forks of the Guadalupe merge, recorded a rise of more than 25 feet in 2 hours. Then it went silent. The water had destroyed the instrument. At 3:36 a.m, the Weather Service issued a second, more urgent warning. At 3:51 a.m, Eastland's SUV went into the river. 14 minutes later, the first 911 call was placed from the camp. An unnamed caller reported roughly 30 girls missing. At 4:03 a.m, the Weather Service finally upgraded to a flash flood emergency, calling it a particularly dangerous situation. By then, the Guadalupe had already crested at 37.5 feet, a record. Cabins that had stood for decades were submerged. Trees that children had climbed that afternoon were underwater to their canopies. Here is a detail that changes the way you think about this story. Camp Mystic sits in an area that FEMA had classified as a special flood hazard area. That designation existed on the official flood insurance rate maps in 2011. But between 2011 and 2020, the camp filed multiple appeals. FEMA redrew the 100-year flood maps several times, and roughly 30 buildings were removed from the official hazard zone. The camp continued to operate and expand in the floodplain. A PBS investigation later concluded that FEMA had missed major flood risks at the site. And Camp Mystic was not the first camp on this river to be hit. On July 17, 1987, an almost identical storm stalled over the same stretch of hill country. The Guadalupe rose 29 feet. At a summer camp called Pot of Gold Christian Camp near Comfort, a bus carrying 43 teenagers tried to evacuate across a low water crossing. The bus stalled in the rising water. A van behind it was trapped. The campers and adults tried to wade to safety by forming a human chain. A wall of water hit them and scattered the chain. 10 teenagers drowned. The survivors were rescued from the tops of trees 75 feet tall, with only 15 feet of branches still above the waterline. After 1987, the Texas legislature did not pass a single piece of flood-related legislation. The low water crossing near Pot of Gold was replaced with a bridge, but broader systemic changes never came. Kerr County, the location of both camp tragedies, had no dedicated flood warning system on the night of July 4, 2025. This was not for lack of awareness. After a flood on the Blanco River killed 13 people in Wimberley in 2015, neighbouring Comal and Bandera counties installed high water detection systems and sirens. Former Kerr County Commissioner Tom Moser called that flood a wake-up call. Plans were proposed for Kerr County. They never materialised. On July the 4th, there were no sirens along the Guadalupe in Kerr County. Downstream in Comfort, a warning system installed after the 1987 disaster did activate. It worked. People in Comfort heard the alarm in time, but upstream at Camp Mystic, along the corridor through Hunt, Ingram and Kerrville, there was only the weather service, phones that barely functioned, and the sound of water rising in the dark. By morning, the scale was becoming clear. 14 helicopters, 12 drones, and more than 500 rescue personnel converged on Kerr County. US Coast Guard crews launched aerial rescues near Kerrville. Petty Officer Scott Ruskin, on the first rescue mission of his entire career, saved 165 people. He was the only triage coordinator on scene. In total, the Coast Guard pulled 223 people from the floodwaters. 850 were rescued altogether. School buses filled with surviving campers arrived at a reunification centre at Ingram Elementary. Some children stepped off the buses and said only 5 words: "I just want to go home." Others had spent the night clinging to trees while counsellors led them in hymns and held them above the waterline as lightning cracked around them. A mother of 3 survivors told reporters that 2 counsellors stood in the rapids while a third stood on a dry hill, passing children hand to hand up a rocky slope in the dark. Many of the girls had lost their shoes. 25 campers and 2 counsellors were dead at Camp Mystic. Among them were 8-year-old twins Hannah and Rebecca Lawrence, 9-year-old Janie Hunt, a cousin of Kansas City Chiefs owner Clark Hunt, 8-year-old Eloise Peck and Dick Eastland, who had purchased the camp in 1974. One camper, 8-year-old Celie Stewart, has never been recovered. Beyond the camp, the HTR Texas Hill Country Campground and the Blue Oak RV Park in Kerrville were destroyed. Families in recreational vehicles were swept away in their sleep. The Casa Bonita community between Hunt and Camp Mystic was devastated. Across 6 counties, 137 people were confirmed dead. 119 of them were in Kerr County alone. In the months that followed, 911 recordings released in January 2026 revealed a gap of nearly 3 hours between the first Weather Service alert at 1:14 in the morning and the first emergency call from Camp Mystic at 4:05. The first call from a member of the Eastland family came at 7:22 when co-director Britt Eastland told the dispatcher the camp was missing as many as 20 to 40 people. 4 wrongful death lawsuits were filed. Families alleged the camp had no legally required evacuation plan, had ignored weather warnings, and had been operating in a known flood zone for decades. The camp's attorneys argued the flooding was unprecedented and that Dick Eastland died trying to save the children the lawsuits say he failed to protect. In December 2025, the Eastland family announced plans to reopen a portion of the camp in 2026. A group of camp parents developed a network of flood detection sensor towers designed to produce 75 decibels inside sleeping structures, enough to wake a child through a closed cabin wall. 100 of them are planned for installation along the Guadalupe before the summer season. Some families supported the plan, others did not. Cece and Will Stewart, whose 8-year-old daughter Siley has still not been found, wrote to the camp. Promoting reopening less than 3 months after the tragedy while one camper remains missing is unthinkable. Catherine McKay Sylvester was 15 years old in 1987, a camper at Pot of Gold when friends drowned in the Guadalupe under nearly identical circumstances. After the 2025 flood, she said something that should stay with anyone who hears it. 10 of my friends lost their lives, and I feel like we did not learn anything from it. That is a disrespect if we are not learning from that and improving it so it does not happen again. The Guadalupe River has flooded more than 42 times in the past century. It flooded before Camp Mystic existed, and it will flood again after the lawsuits are settled and the sensor towers are installed and the memorials have been built. That is not a prediction, it is limestone. And the question is the same one it has always been, not whether the water will rise, but whether anyone will be listening when it does. If this story was worth 15 minutes of your time, consider subscribing. Stories like this deserve to be heard, especially the ones that are easy to forget.